This video is brought to you by Squarespace. From websites and online stores to marketing tools and analytics, Squarespace is the all-in-one platform to build a beautiful online presence and run your business. When a painting lands in my studio, it's here because somebody loves it, cares for it, and wants to see it have a future. At least that's true for most paintings, but not all. You see, sometimes a painting lands here because nobody wants it or cares about it or has any plans for its future. Sometimes they land here because this is the end of the line and they're just abandoned. Evert Peters was a Dutch artist in the late 1800s and early 1900s, known primarily for his landscapes and interior scenes. But throughout his career, one vignette kept appearing, that of a fisherman being pulled by horse on wagon looking for shells on the shore. And this may be one of his finest examples, though in its current condition, it is not. Covered with a very heavy layer of surface grime, a discolored old varnish, multiple tears and punctures throughout, it has seen better days, and hopefully will see more in the future. This painting, this orphan, as it were, also deserves a home. And that's where this project differs from most that I have in the studio. You see, when the work is complete, this painting will be auctioned off, and all of the proceeds will be donated to Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders. So not only will you be adopting this orphan, you'll be helping other people as well. And that feels like a bright future for a painting that almost met its end. And to learn a little bit more about the artist, the past, and the future of the painting, I've created a website, and you bet it, with Squarespace. So believe it or not, in all the years of working with Squarespace, this is the first website I've built on the platform. And in about 10-12 minutes, I was done. I didn't have to do any coding at all. I used their fluid design engine to simply drag and drop the elements around the page and design as I wanted. I was also able to use the AI engine to clean up and clarify the copy that I wrote for the website. I'm not a professional writer, so this helps a ton. Squarespace made it so simple that even I was able to build a website. So head over to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/Baumgartner to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. I mentioned that when this painting came to the studio, it was effectively the end of the line for it. It came to me by way of an auction house that I've been working with for nearly 2 decades. A client had brought them the painting hoping to auction it off, and when the auction house suggested emphatically that the painting be conserved, the tear fixed, and the painting cleaned before auctioning it, the client said, well, throw it away. I don't actually care about it that much, and I don't want it back. The auction house, of course, did not want to throw the painting away, and they called me and said, Julian, would you like this painting? I said, no, I do not want the painting. It will sit in my storage forever. And they said, well, then it's going into the trash. And I said, fine, bring it over. And they did, and it sat in my storage for nearly 5 years. And only recently, when I was cleaning out the storage room, I came upon this painting. I had long since forgotten that it was in the storage room, and I decided that something needed to be done. It couldn't just languish in my storage room any longer, and it was too fine of a painting to be considered an organ donor. And sometimes we receive paintings that are too far gone, too damaged, or just in such awful condition that the only thing left for them is to be used for experimentation in hopes that we can develop a new technique or material that will save another painting. Now, to do the conservation work for the orphan painting, I first need to remove it from its stretcher. It has a tear, it's dirty, the paint layer is very cracked and tenuously held on, so I need to do several treatments on the hot table, and in order to do that, it needs to be separated from the support. After removing all of the tears, I can pull this painting off of the support. But something fell out when I was flipping it over, and this is what's called an iron key, and I'll explain these later on. But just notice that there are 2 of them, not 4 like they're supposed to be. And this is a big issue that's going to have to be dealt with. But I'll deal with that later on. First, I want to focus on the painting. Removing it from the stretcher support isn't terribly difficult. This one wasn't glued down, it wasn't stuck to it, it was just on it. Now, the canvas is dirty. It's been sitting in storage, mine and previously for many years, and when it's sitting in storage, it just accumulates grime. So I'm going to vacuum off the back. This is really the extent of the intervention on the back of the canvas that I need to do. I don't want to introduce moisture or solvents to this canvas. It's not damaged, and I don't see any reason to put it through any stress. Now, cleaning it off, I will find little areas that are dents or tears, and that's one of the benefits of taking the time to clean the back off, is that I get to see the canvas a little bit more closely than if I just assumed everything was right. Now, I've dampened some blotter papers, and I've placed them on the tear. I need to flatten this tear out a little bit. I'll change out the blotter papers every once in a while to ensure that all of the moisture is pulled out, and then when I'm confident that the canvas is dry, I can begin the first step in repairing this tear. Before I do any treatments on the hot table, I want to make sure that this tear is stabilized. And what I'm going to try to do here is quasi-reweaving. I've looked at this tear, and unfortunately the fibers of the canvas are too frayed for me to do a proper reweaving technique. But what I can do is reorient all of these loose fibers so that they have a more grid-like texture. Sometimes we have loose fibers from the canvas, these strands here. Sometimes we don't. And when we do, we can try to orient them into place so that there is less of a gap where the tear was. This just makes for a stronger repair and adds more fidelity to the canvas. Right here, I am trying to reweave it, but there's very little canvas left, and it's very, very brittle, so it's only partially successful. On the diagonal, where it's impossible to reweave, I'll at least try to orient the fibers, and then put some adhesive on it, and then press it until it's dry. This is now ready to go onto the hot table for its first treatment. This treatment is simply going to relax the canvas and encourage the cracking to disappear. Once paint film is cracked, we can't uncrack it. You can't unring a bell, and you can't unbreak a cup if it falls. But what we can do is remove the tenting, the tendency that the paint has to lift up and stand proud, which catches the light and becomes a visual distraction. I'm going to turn down the pressure. I don't need a ton in this case, and that could cause damage to the paint film. I'll heat the table up, introduce the vacuum pressure, and then once it's up to temperature, I'll turn the heat off, allow it to cool, and then transfer it over and press it for a couple of days. I haven't introduced any moisture to this painting. Simply the relative humidity in the air was enough to encourage it flat. Once it's rested for a few days, I can come back and transfer it over to the other table in preparation for its second hot table treatment. Now, I mentioned that the paint layer was pretty brittle, and I'm going to do an adhesive impregnation, which is where an adhesive is heated up and then thinned out with a solvent and then rolled on the back of the canvas. It's allowed to penetrate through the canvas, up into any of the voids, up through the cracks, and effectively anywhere there's airspace or gaps, this adhesive will fill. I use a roller to apply this as opposed to a brush because it's much more effective at getting a nice even coating. I've tried spraying it, but because of the solvents, it is less safe for me, and it also gums up the spray gun. So a roller is effectively the best tool for applying this adhesive evenly. And even matters, because if it's not even, well, number one, it's not going to be a good treatment. And number two, it could be blotchy or look unsightly when I'm done with the treatment. And we don't want that. Once the adhesive has been allowed to dry and cool, it was heated up, remember, I'll transfer it back over to the hot table and sandwich it in between two siliconized pieces of mylar. And this is so that the painting doesn't stick to the table or to anything else. Yes, I have forgotten to do this in the past and been shocked to discover that the painting has been glued to the hot table. Luckily for me, because this is a heat-activated adhesive, all I need to do is heat the table up, the adhesive becomes soft, and then I can peel the painting off. But it's a real pain, it makes a real mess, and it puts a pretty sour spin on my day. so I generally try to avoid making those unforced errors. Again, the painting is wrapped in cotton webbing, which is the evacuation path for all of the air that is going to be stuck in this envelope that I create. I'll attach some through bag connectors which allow me to extract the air, and then I'll turn on the vacuum pump and put pressure onto the painting. Again, the painting is brought up to temperature, allowed to sit in that temperature for a little bit, and then it's cooled. And once it's cooled, I can remove all of this film and remove the painting from the hot table and head back to the front of the studio because we're now done in the back half. Now, though I did try to repair that tear or at least strengthen it, I'm not comfortable leaving it just like that. It's probably good enough. In fact, I'm almost certain that it's strong enough, but I'm going to take a belt and suspenders approach. And I'm going to do what's called bridging. Now, I've taken a piece of Belgian linen canvas, I've frayed it, and I've cut off some of the fray. And I'm going to use an adhesive, and I'm going to lay these strands perpendicularly across the tear, kind of like a butterfly suture. This is not reweaving, this is not stitching. All that this is going to do is hold the tear in place. It's going to make sure that it doesn't have a tendency to open up or move as the relative humidity in the future environment changes. I'll lay each strand down and then I'll apply a little adhesive on it. And then I'll move on to the next and repeat until I've covered the entire tear. For a small tear like this, it only takes about 20 minutes or so, but for larger tears, it can take several hours, and I'll usually break those up into smaller sections. As we make a right turn, I will pivot the bridging so that it follows the tear perpendicularly, providing the maximum support. And then I'll apply the adhesive to all of the little strands, and I'll orient them if they've gone astray and make sure that it looks nice and it's all even. And then I'll put a piece of siliconized mylar on top, a piece of felt to compensate for the textural difference, and then a weight, and I will let it sit there for a couple of hours. I'll come back a little bit later and I'll remove the siliconized mylar. The adhesive is almost completely dry now, so I can just put the felt on, and this will help it dry even faster. The next day I come back and the adhesive is dry, the bridging is well bonded, and that tear is stabilized. So now I can turn my attention to the tacking edge. Because this is going back on the stretcher, I want to make sure that this tacking edge has the maximum fidelity that it can. I don't want to do a treatment and then discover later on that the tacking edge has torn or the tacks have pulled through because it was weak. So I'm going to do what's called a reinforcement. I'm going to use silk organza and some adhesive strips. Now these adhesive strips will get ironed on, and then the top layer of release film will be peeled off, revealing just a thin layer of adhesive. This is the same adhesive that I use when I need to line a painting, and in fact the same adhesive in a different form as I used for the adhesive impregnation. But it's at this point when I decide that the reinforcement, while probably going to be good enough, isn't going to cut it. I went belt and suspenders for the tear repair, so I'm going to do belt and suspenders for the tacking edge and do a full strip lining. This differs from a reinforcement in that instead of using very thin silk organza and just adding a little bit of reinforcement, I'm using a full piece of Belgian linen, and I'm effectively adding a whole new tacking edge. The edge is frayed to make sure that there's no crisp, hard line that could potentially telegraph to the front of the painting, and also to make sure that there's the maximum amount of surface area for the glue to bond the canvases together. I'll iron it down and then follow the iron with my weight with a piece of red oak on it. This is effectively what's known as a clapper, and the red oak will absorb any of the ambient moisture and keep the canvas from rippling. I'll trim off the extra fray and then add the other tacking edges. Once all four sides have been strip lined, then the painting is ready to be stretched. At least I thought it was, until I flipped it over and realized that I had forgotten to clean the painting. Way to go, Julian. Moving a little bit too fast today. For the Orphan's cleaning, I'm taking a hybrid approach where I clean both the surface grime off and remove the old varnish at the same time. This is a technique that is possible, but not often used because the paintings generally don't allow it to be used. Sometimes the paint layer is too fragile or vulnerable, or the composition of the surface grime and the varnish just don't work with this approach. But for this painting, the stars are aligned and I can remove both the surface grime and the old varnish at the same time. And that begins by applying a neutral organic soap that I mix in the studio. This breaks down the surface grime and makes it soluble. And then I come back with a solvent mixture that I've previously tested on the painting, and I remove both the soluble surface grime and the natural resin-based varnish. And you can see, even in the foreground where it's mostly browns, the change is pretty dramatic. The browns are not all dark and dirty. There are some warm tones. There are even some light blues and oranges in there that previously were not as easy to see. Cleaning the figure and the horse will also reveal a suite of colors that were previously much more muted and less dramatic. And of course, when we clean a painting of its surface grime, the accumulation of dust, dirt, smoke, particulate, gunk, grime, we get to the old varnish layer, which is often discolored from years of exposure to light and oxygen. And when that's removed, well, now we can see what we're really in store for. This painting is going to be glorious. A bright blue sky filled with thick cumulonimbus clouds, a beautiful day to go fishing for shells. Now, all of this was hidden underneath that old surface grime and varnish. And the thing about surface grime and varnish is that it changes so slowly that we don't often perceive it, much like we go gray or we develop smile lines and wrinkles. In the mirror, every day, we just see ourselves. Same with the painting. It just looks like itself. But it's not until we take a step back and we look at old photographs of ourselves or of the painting that we notice how much it's changed. And for ourselves, this can be sad and an unfortunate occurrence, such as the passing of time. But for paintings, this can be changed. And this is why conservators exist, to roll back the time that's taken a toll on the painting. And for this painting, a good cleaning and rolling back some of those years makes a huge difference. It's almost as if it's a whole new painting. And that makes the cleaning process super exciting. Now, if only there were a way to apply that to gray hairs and wrinkles. Now, with the painting finally cleaned, I can focus on the paint losses around that tear. Even though I've done structural work to make sure that the canvas is stable, there's still a void. All of that paint layer is missing. And this painting has a pretty nice impasto, pretty beautiful texture. The brushwork that the artist used when they created the painting is evident. And I need to recreate that. And what better way to recreate brushwork than with a brush? So I'm taking a fan brush and simply following the motions of the artist's brush and trying to replicate what he did, continuing his brush into that fill-in medium. And I'll go around the entire painting, the perimeter, and all of the areas where I can find little losses and fill them in. And a few hours later, once that fill-in has been allowed to dry, I can come back with some swabs and a little bit of water and remove the excess. I only want to fill in where there are losses, not covering the original paint. It's not terribly difficult to remove, but I do have to take care not to flatten or remove that texture that I built up. If I do, which sometimes happens, I can always rebuild the texture. It's not the end of the world, but the less time I have to spend redoing work that I'm already happy with, well, the better it is for me and the painting. And now I can return this painting to the stretcher, which I have cleaned and inspected for damage and determined that it's fine. It's just a little old and a little dirty. I'll orient the painting on this stretcher support, making sure that it's square and that all of the image is visible. And then, using some steel tacks, I'll begin in the center of each side and drive a few tacks in. And what I'm looking to do is create a spot of tension in the center of the canvas. I'm not really worried about the edges or the sides just yet because I can deal with those later on during the stretching process. But I need to worry about the center. So putting a couple of tacks on this side and then pulling it taut with my hands, you can see I create effectively a vertical line of tension down the painting. And then when I recreate this on the sides, it meets in the middle and creates a square or a circle of tension. Then I can move from the center of each side to the corners, pulling any slack to the corners where the keys, those iron keys I mentioned previously, will compensate and take up that slack. Sometimes I'll use a pulling plier to add extra tension to the painting if it really needs it, but more often than not, my hands are strong enough and sufficient enough to add the requisite tension. I'm not looking to create a drum here, I just want to make sure that there are no areas of slack. We can always add more tension with the keys later on. I'll trim off all of the excess canvas from the strip lining. I don't need it bunching up in the corners, and it's of no use to me, and it gets in the way, so I'll trim it off. And then I can fold over the extra canvas and tack it with some smaller tacks. This has almost no structural effect, but it really looks nice, and it's a sign to the future owner that care was taken with this painting. Also, if the painting ever needs to come off and be restretched, all of this extra canvas will make the future conservator's job a little bit easier than if I were to say cut it all off and just leave that 3/4 of an inch of original tacking edge. It would certainly be possible to use that, but it'd be harder, and I'm not looking to make anybody else's life hard. So now with the painting married to the stretcher support, it's time for keying. But that poses a problem, because remember, we only have 2 iron keys. And now I need to solve that. The first thing that I'm going to do is use some of this engineering marking fluid on the face of these keys. And this goes on in purple and it dries really fast. And what it allows me to do is to create really crisp, really thin, precise lines with a scribe. So using my straight edge and my very sharp scribe, simply dragging it across the surface marks the marking fluid and leaves a very crisp line. You can see 2 of them right there. But why would I need crisp lines on the face of this iron key, Julian? Well, because I'm going to modify it. Remember that we only have 2, meaning 2 were lost, and 1 almost was lost when it fell out. The remaining key was held in place with a single nail, and I suspect the others were too, which is not a good track record. 1 out of 4 certainly won't cut it. So I'm going to modify this key. I have a mill, why not? These types of projects are really fun. They allow me to develop new skills and perfect those that I don't use very often, and also it just breaks up the monotony of every day. So using my mill and a high-speed bit, I'm going to create a channel in the face of this key. I'm going to make many shallow passes, fairly slow, into this key using this high-speed bit. And that ensures that there's no jumping around, no chattering, that I don't break the bit or send something flying across the studio. This iron key is just that, it's cast iron, so it's fairly soft and easy to work with. One of the neat things is that when it gets worked, the iron becomes magnetic and sticks to everything. So it's not as simple as just blowing off all of the little shavings. So back and forth, and then slightly deeper, then back and forth, slightly deeper, so on and so forth, until I hit that aluminum plate that I put on top of the clamp to protect the clamp. And you'll see, there it is, the aluminum in bright silver coming through. And that means that I'm all the way through. And then I get to do it all over on the other side. Now, why am I creating 2 channels in this key, Julian? Well, just follow along. Come with me on this journey, and it will all make sense in the end. Trust me. But for now, I'm changing my bit to a countersink bit, and I'm going to create a bevel on this channel. And this is going to receive a screw, so that when I tap this key into place, I can then drive 2 screws and hold it in place so it doesn't get lost. And of course I want it to sit flush, which is why I'm creating the bevel. So after doing it for all of them, I now have 2 beautifully machined iron keys ready to go into the support and have screws to keep them from getting lost. And then using a little solvent, I can clean off the marking solution and we have 2 keys and we're ready to go. Except we're not, because we're missing 2 more. Now I thought about casting them. I also thought about sending them off to a machine shop to get recreated in steel. But ultimately, I figured, why not just 3D print them? If that fails, then I can take one of the other routes. So after taking a photograph and bringing it into the CAD software and using a caliper to get all the dimensions accurate, I'm just modeling them up so that I have a 3D version. This is a fun and easy project that I can do when I'm not in the studio and bored, as if that's ever really the case. And then I can add my logo because why not? I can. And then I'll take this and I'll send it off to my 3D printer, and then hopefully we'll have 2 more keys. I've oriented it on the printer in a way that has the least amount of waste and gives me a diagonal cross section, which should be strong enough to handle the force of the hammer. But we'll see, who knows? After a couple minutes, really it only took maybe 15 or 20 to print each of these, I have 2 more. Now these are printed with carbon reinforced PLA, so basic plastic with carbon fiber, which should make them strong enough for the tapping and the use that I intend on putting them to. But we will find out. So back at the painting with my iron keys and my plastic carbon reinforced iron keys and a whole bunch of screws, I'm going to first insert the original iron keys, tap them into place. You can see the stretcher support just expanding a little bit. And then I'll tap in one of my 3D printed ones and hope that it doesn't just spontaneously combust. Lo and behold, it doesn't. It's plenty strong. And then with all of them in place, I can take my screws and screw this down. Now, if these ever need to be keyed out again, more tension added, all that the next person will have to do is loosen up these screws by a couple of turns, tap in the keys to create more tension, and then tighten the screws. This is common with iron keys. These just didn't have these slots, so I modified them to match what I had seen in the past. So there you go. 3D printed and doing the job just like they should. It's kind of neat, actually, when you think about it. We went from nothing to something, all in the studio, and it cost, a whole 30 cents worth of plastic. This is a really interesting solution, and I'm always looking for creative and novel ideas and ways to make my work faster, better, crisper, you name it. And 3D printing is just one of the avenues that I continuously explore. And now it's time to apply the varnish layer. And I'm using a new brush that I'm testing out for varnishing that's been prototyped specifically for me in the studio, and hopefully something will come of that. But for right now, it's a dream. The brush has a great hand feel, it holds a ton of varnish, and the bristles have a wonderful spring that lets me feel the surface of the painting while I'm applying the varnish. I know this is kind of getting into the weeds, but for somebody who applies gallons upon gallons of varnish every year, this makes a big difference. Having tools that are designed for you, for your hand, for a specific purpose, make that job not only more enjoyable, but easier. And again, I'm always looking to make my life and my work a little bit easier, because then it can be faster and I can do more of it and for less cost. And that's a win for everybody. And now we're on to retouching. There's not a lot of retouching here, but leaving it as is certainly isn't an option. So I'm going to mix up some retouching paints. These are powdered pigment in synthetic resin. Unlike oil paints, which use oil as the binder, these do not become permanent, and they don't change over time. Oil darkens as it ages, but these paints don't. They're also fully reversible, so with a solvent I can remove them in the future, meaning that everything that I'm doing here is not permanent. It's temporary. If somebody comes along and develops a better technique, well, they can remove my old work. Or if the painting ever needs to be conserved again because something happens to it, again, my work can be removed. And that's one of the tenets of modern conservation, making sure that everything we do is not permanent, or at least as impermanent as possible, while delivering the best results for the painting and the client. Sometimes we do have to take techniques that are more permanent, but we want to try, whenever possible, to leave as light of a footprint as we can. And retouching is just one of those areas. You've seen countless times where I've had to scrape off old oil paint retouching because it no longer matches in color or because something happened. The future conservators won't have to deal with that problem. And that's really wonderful. If somebody in the future can avoid having to do all of the painstaking grunt work that I've had to do, well, I kind of owe it to them to make that possible. So this is just the first round of retouching. I'll come back in a day and take a look at it and make any adjustments that I feel are necessary. But after doing that a couple of times, the painting is now ready to go back into the frame. And I'm putting a backing board on it to protect the back and to hold it a little bit flat. You can see that the stretcher is a little twisted, and sometimes that happens. This isn't a terribly high quality stretcher. Again, it doesn't have mortises, so it's just nailed together, so it has a tendency to twist. This backing board will help counteract that and also protect the back of the painting from incidental damage. And then I'm going to install a hanging wire on this painting, so the person who ends up with this Orphan simply can hang it on the wall. And then finally, way back in the beginning, when I took the painting out of the frame, I saved the labels that were on all of that backing material. I don't know what they mean, but I'm going to save them in case anybody does discover. And then my label with all of the information, and the painting is complete. What started off as an abandoned painting with no future, almost headed for the trash can, has now been given a new lease on life. This painting by Everett Peters of a fisherman walking along the shore with his horse looking for shells is a quiet, contemplative scene, one that Peters recreated over and over in his career. The clouds are fluffy and light, the birds are now visible in the sky, the reflection is crisp, and you can feel the water sitting on the sand. Previously, it was a dirty, discolored, damaged painting that, well, nobody wanted. But now, with a little bit of care and attention, this painting, once abandoned, is now ready for a new future. This Orphan is ready to go home. When the painting arrived, the situation was not great, but as it's leaving, it's simply spectacular. It's hard to imagine that this painting almost met its end. So there's the Orphan, ready to be adopted and find a new home. And if you think that's yours, check the description for a link to the auction, and good luck.